Yes.
Sir, just two matters I'm going to pick up from yesterday. Firstly, you asked the question when we looked at the annual returns as to whether there was any apparent correlation between the severity of haemophilia, mild, moderate or severe, and the receipt of more than one type of concentrate or treatment. And the answer is, Ms. Fraser-Buckland, having analysed the return data for 1978, 1979, 1980 and 1984, that there's no apparent correlation. The second point arises out of the documents I referred to yesterday in relation to the proposed exchange in around 1988, 1989 between Northern Ireland and Scotland at the time of Z8 usage. And the later evidence, I'm not going to put the documents up on screen, but later evidence suggests that that exchange did take place. And that there was an exchange of Z8 allocated to Northern Ireland with commercial products supplied by Scotland. We looked yesterday afternoon at documents relevant to what was or should have been known and understood by those working in clinical roles at the centre about risks of hepatitis. Before I move to do a similar exercise in relation to HIV and AIDS, I just want to refer to Dr. Main's most recent statement and what she says about the information she says was provided to patients. Shomik, could we have WITN 0736009? And could we go to page 46, please? This part of the statement is in relation to a series of questions posed by the inquiry about the process of consent. And if we pick it up at paragraph 69.1, Dr. Main says this: the customary practice of the Northern Ireland Haemophilia Centre was to check patients' blood at every visit. I must stress that many patients attended at widely spaced intervals, at times 6 months to a year apart for those that were mildly or moderately affected. Those that were severely affected or were involved in the programme of home treatment were seen and checked more frequently. And then she refers to forms which those on home treatment completed. And then at 69.2, she says, thereafter they, I take it those of the home treatment patients, were seen at monthly intervals. It was, in my view, imperative that their bloods were checked to ensure that they'd not developed any haematological problems, such as anemia, unduly excessive bleeding, or the development of inhibitor that would negate the efficacy of their concentrate. And finally, to check on their liver function tests and hepatitis status. So part of the monthly testing for those on home treatment appears to have been, according to Dr. Main, not just to look at liver function tests, but to expressly consider the question of hepatitis. And then in 69.3, she says patients were well versed in this practice and accepted the information given to them about the blood testing and the purposes for which they were being taken. They seemed happy to consent to these arrangements. What that paragraph doesn't do is spell out what information it is Dr. Main says was routinely given to patients about blood testing and the purposes for which tests were being undertaken. If we then go to the...
Well, it would imply that what they were told was that the checks were for their hepatitis status.
It might well imply that.
And the expression "they seemed happy to consent" suggests that there was no active consent. It was an assumption by her that they were happy.
Yes. And we'll see a similar expression when we look at the question of consent to treatment on the next page. So those questions concerned consent in relation to blood testing. These questions concern consent in relation to treatment. At 70.1, she says this: all patients attending the centre were happy to receive treatment with factor concentrates. In the early days of treatment with concentrates, it was not the practice at the time to obtain written informed consent. Patients, to put it mildly, were overjoyed at receiving concentrate treatment. As the home treatment programme progressed, some severely affected patients felt left out and contacted the centre to request the opportunity of participating in the home treatment programme. And then this, everyone was told of the risk of viral infections associated with all blood and blood products. Now again, what that doesn't identify is what actual information was provided to patients about the risk of viral infections. And I should add, having reread every statement received by the inquiry by or about a patient treated at the Belfast Haemophilia Centre, that does not accord, what Dr. Main says here, does not accord with any of the evidence that the inquiry has received from patients or their family members. If we then just go down the page, just to complete what Dr. Main says, she says at 71.1, for the purpose of clarification, at the instigation of concentrate therapy, all matters pertaining at that time in respect of risk were conveyed to patients before they commenced on home treatment. Discussions included comparison of treatment with cryoprecipitate and treatment with concentrates. No figures were mentioned, but patients understood that concentrates came from a large number of donors in comparison to cryoprecipitate. Of course, if that's right, it doesn't follow that they understood and were informed about the relative risks or potential consequences as a result of those risks. However, the prospect of their lives being revolutionised, the ease of injection and the ability to undertake reliable dose calculations precluded any obvious reservations about the treatment. No patient ever expressed any reservation to myself or any other member of staff in respect of their treatment. And again, just picking up on some of the evidence from patients and relatives that the inquiries received, there are patients who recall being delighted about factor concentrates. There are patients who describe being left with the impression that these were pioneering treatments, is the phrase used in one statement, miracle treatments, wonder drug, although I should say in relation to the latter, Dr. Main has said that's not a phrase she would have used. But those are the recollections of patients. None recount a recollection of being advised of risks of significant health consequences as a potential result of receipt of factor concentrates. Sorry, I should just complete the series of answers by going over the page, the top of the next page. This is in relation to testing and whether patients were tested without their express consent, and I'll come on to that later on this morning. But whilst we're in this statement, Dr. Main's answer is absolutely not. That's to the question of were patients tested for HIV or hepatitis or for any other purpose without their express consent. She says she obtained verbal consent from the patient in all cases. And again, there is evidence that the inquiry holds from patients which is to the opposite effect. And I'll refer to that a little later.
If we just go back a page. And 71.1, she's speaking in the first sentence of when concentrate therapy on home treatment was begun. It may, but it probably isn't, talking about treatment not at home, but in hospital, because it refers to HT.
Yes.
But it doesn't say that there was any further discussion in respect of the risks as they became better known in the case of hepatitis non-A, non-B, or as they were becoming known in respect of the risks of whatever it was that caused AIDS later identified. Is there anything in her witness statement which deals with what she says about the continued conversations that might have been expected in the light of the changed and developing perception of risks?
I don't think so, sir. I am going to show you in the course of the morning some other parts of her statement where she talks about the provision of information to patients and what she says, in particular in relation to the question of providing information about HIV and AIDS. So I don't think we have any form of narrative about, as things became clearer, this is what I explained. We do when we get to the mid-1990s, 1995 specifically, which of course by which time infections will already have occurred. We do have a more detailed account of the weekend that was organised in around 1995 to provide information that was said about hepatitis C. But I can't recall any account which picks up upon the point that you've just made, but I will check that, both so that I can be confident I've given you an accurate answer and, of course, out of fairness to Dr. Main. So I'm going to move next to documentation and evidence relevant to what was, as a matter of fact, known in Belfast, or what should have been known in Belfast by the clinicians, I hasten to add, not patients, about the risk of AIDS and HTLV3. So if we go back to that same document, please, Seamus, WITN 07360009. We start with Dr. Main's witness statement and go to page 25, please. We can see at the top of the page, Dr. Main says this: the immune deficiency syndrome, which later became known as HIV/AIDS, first came to my notice during an informal lunchtime discussion with 3 colleagues. They were the late Arthur Bloom, virologist John Krask, and the late Peter Kernoff. John Krask was describing the content of a paper just published, to the best of my recollection in The Lancet, but with the passage of time I cannot be more specific. It described an account of an immune condition which had occurred in homosexual males in San Francisco. I inquired as to the relevance to haemophilia. He reminded us that the individuals cited in the paper were known to maintain their lifestyle by being paid blood donors, as was documented in the World in Action 1975 programme. Whilst the revelations of that were horrific, I was unprepared for the shock of the news of a possible future infection which could affect those in receipt of plasma-derived concentrates, namely the haemophiliac population. Dr. Main, perhaps unsurprisingly, can't recall when this conversation took place. There is a Lancet article that might be the article that's described at PRSE 304476. I'm not going to go through the detail of it. You'll see it's a letter to the editor about something then referred to as gay compromise syndrome, and it refers to an outbreak of a remarkable outbreak of opportunistic lung infections and/or Kaposi's sarcoma in homosexual men reported this year in the United States. And if so, that's an article in the Lancet, 12th of December 1981. So that might fit the bill in terms of helping us to date the discussion to which Dr. Main refers. If we go next to Dr. Main's HIV litigation report, CBLA 5072_024, and if we turn to, I think it's page 32, Seamus. So under the heading, the development of the AIDS epidemic, if we go to the bottom of the page, Dr. Main says this: early publications during 1981 and 1982, and the footnoted publications there are footnote 62 is a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine by Gottlieb, Schroff, Schanker and others about PCP pneumonia, evidence of a new acquired cellular immunodeficiency. It's 1981 New England Journal of Medicine. I don't have the precise date, but we can check that. The 1982 publication to which she's referring is in the Annals of Internal Medicine, 1982, an article by Friedman, Kine and others, disseminated Kaposi's sarcoma in homosexual men. So in any event, she says early publications during 1981 and 1982 describing the unexpected outbreaks of the rare disorders PCP and Kaposi's sarcoma in homosexuals provoked discussion amongst Hemophilia Centre directors as early as September 1982. And we'll look at that in a moment. At that time, particular relevance to haemophilia care was not yet evident. In July 1982, MMWR reported that 3 hemophiliacs had developed AIDS, but little evidence had accumulated to suggest that hemophiliacs of themselves constituted a special risk group for AIDS. And then she says, the top of the next page, the situation changed with increasing hemophiliac involvement, and towards the end of the year, so that's towards the end of 1982, they were categorised as a separate at-risk population. And then she goes on to refer to some UK HCDO interactions, which I'll deal with separately. So, again, there's nothing in Dr. Main's HIV litigation report to suggest that these developments were unknown to her or unknown to the Haemophilia Centre directors, members, or organisation members. On the contrary, the implication might be thought to be she's setting this out precisely because they were known and were a subject of discussion. So that's what she says in the litigation report about the knowledge in 1982. I should just remind you, sir, although we've looked at a number of occasions, of the UK HCDO records of discussions in 1982. We start with HCDO 40410. You will recall this is the Reference Centre Directors meeting on the 6th of September 1982, attended by Dr. Main and by Dr. Krask as well, and by a number of others. If we go to page 8, we see towards the bottom of the page the beginning of a verbal report from Dr. Krask about the work of the Hepatitis Working Party. And then if we go on to page 11, in the paragraph halfway down the page beginning, Professor Bloom asked Dr. Krask if he had any information about the acquired immune deficiency syndrome following reports from the United States and the possible relationship of this syndrome with blood products and hepatitis. Dr. Krask said that he would find out more about this and agreed to try to have some information available for the Haemophilia Centre directors at the Manchester meeting. And then if we go to the Haemophilia Centre directors meeting the following week at CBLA 301619, so this is the Manchester meeting of the bigger group of Haemophilia Centre directors, 13th of September 1982. The list of attendees on the second page tells us that Dr. Main was present, and there is a short discussion about AIDS on page 10. Bottom of the page, the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The Reference Centre directors had asked Dr. Krask to look into the report from the United States of this syndrome, mainly in homosexuals, but including 3 hemophiliacs. It appeared that there was a remote possibility that commercial blood products had been involved, and we've considered in earlier hearings the question, which will ultimately be for you to resolve, sir, whether that was a fair or accurate statement, given the state of knowledge already by that time. Dr. Crass asked the directors to let him know if they had any cases of the syndrome. The working party was considering the implications of the reports from the USA. So those are the minutes of the September 1982 meetings. Obviously, we don't have a more detailed account of the underlying discussions because the minutes are only, on any view, a summary. What we do know is that in November 1982, Dr. Crask produced the first version of a report about AIDS. If we go to HCDO 40557, we see a letter from Dr. Crask dated the 11th of November 1982. This letter is addressed to Miss Spooner. We do have copies of this letter addressed to others, including, I think, Dr. Kernoff and at least one other reference centre director. What's not clear from what we have been able to analyse is whether this letter was being sent solely to members of the Hepatitis Working Party, which would not have included Dr. Main, or whether it was being sent at this point in time to the reference centre directors as well, which would have included Dr. Main. So I'm afraid at the moment simply don't know the answer to that and that question. But in any event, we have over the page the first version of a report prepared by Dr. Crask. It's dated the 5th of November 1982 on its third page. And if we look at the second page, sorry, the next page, my apologies, Seamus. Bottom half of the page, we see the passage we've explored before under the heading Etiology. Several theories have been advanced. It seems likely that this is a new syndrome, and then he sets out the three theories: effective drugs, and says this is not a factor. A second theory is the immunosuppressive effect of cytomegalovirus infection, and he says this seems unlikely. And then over the page, the third possible cause, the association with sexual promiscuity, intravenous drug use, and possibly the transfusion of commercial blood concentrates. And then he says, just below that, if 3 is the most likely cause, then it seems possible that such an agent might be present in the plasma of hepatitis B carriers used to prepare hepatitis B vaccines. The relevance of that was that this was a paper Dr. Crask had prepared at that stage for the Medical Research Council's Hepatitis Vaccine Working Group. So that's November 1982. If we then go to PRSE 302647, this again is a document that we have looked at on a number of occasions. It's one of the records of the meeting with Immuno at London Airport, or at a London Airport hotel, on the 24th of January 1983. And if we go to the last page, please, we see in the bottom half of the page the list of attendees, and we'll see that they include Dr. Main. If we go to the page before that, we can see the heading almost halfway down the page, Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, and we see there set out the discussion about AIDS, Dr. Crask summarising the current position, giving a clinical description of the AIDS syndrome, and then picking it up towards the bottom of the page, reference to the mortality rate, 45% mortality. And then in the last paragraph, a description of hemophiliacs in the United States affected. 10 affected, 5 have died, youngest age 7. All cases have had prolonged treatment with factor 8, but there is no specific implication of one particular product or batch. Other cases involving blood and blood product transmission have included platelets transfused in 3 cases. In one of these cases, one of the donors was a young New York man in his 20s A second case was a 20-month-old child with rhesus HDN who'd received several units, including platelets known to have come from a homosexual donor who was asymptomatic at the time but who later died. And that's the San Francisco baby case. And if we go over the page, the discussion continues with reference to the incubation period. In the UK, so far, only 1 or 2 cases have been reported from the Communicable Diseases Centre. There's then reference to protocols from the United States that are being considered by the Hepatitis Working Party, and a reference to American fractionation companies being very aware of the problem. And then in the next paragraph, a discussion of the editorial, so that's the Desforges editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine, 13th of January 1983. That it's a matter for you, sir, but may be taken as a guide to what, by 24th of January 1983, would have been known to Dr. Main about the latest developments in the state of knowledge in relation to AIDS risk for haemophiliacs. There was then, again in terms of the chronology in early 1983, which is of some particular significance for Belfast patients because of the dates of seroconversion for most of them, which I'll come on to later. Continuing with the chronology, there's then a reference centre directors meeting in February 1983. That's at HCDO 40411, I think. No, it's right, I should note, the covering letter, which sends out the draft minutes, is the 9th of May 1983. So it's several months after the meeting on the 14th of February 1983. I mention that because if we look at the next page, we can see that Dr. Main did not attend this particular reference centre directors meeting on the 14th of February 1983. We see apologies for absence were received from her. If we go to page 5, Shomik, we can see the discussion about the AIDS syndrome. Professor Bloom reporting it would be discussed at the Stockholm meeting of the World Federation of Hemophilia. Reports from the United States indicated that the incidence of AIDS was higher than at first thought, and there was some concern that the haemophilic population of the UK who had received American concentrates might be at risk. And then there is a discussion of a form being prepared for the reporting of cases, and Dr. Krask was going to draw that up, and it would be circulated to all haemophilia centre directors with appropriate notes regarding the criteria on which a diagnosis should be based. And I should note, although Dr. Main wasn't present at that meeting, her HIV litigation report does refer to that meeting. So it may be something that she was aware of and aware of the discussion. But we can't say that for certain. We do know, however, that as agreed at that meeting, Drs. Krask, Ritzer and Bloom did write to all centre directors, so that would have included Dr. Main, in March of 1983. And we can see the letter at HCDO 40517_001. This is the letter of the 22nd of March 1983. Again, we've looked at it before, but not, as it were, through the prism of the Belfast Haemophilia Centre. Dear Director, re-acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And then there's reference to recent discussions in both the Hepatitis Working Party and a recent meeting of reference centre directors, and the system being set up for the reporting of possible cases of AIDS. And then the letter continues that this is the second paragraph, the criteria for reporting cases are given in the accompanying paper, AIDS 2, and a request is made to use the form AIDS 3. If we look at the enclosed documents themselves, They are, first of all, we start with the AIDS 1 report. That's HCDO 40517_002. So this is an updated version of Dr. Krask's November 1982 report. It's dated at the end of the paper, the 1st of March 1983. Again, it sets out the growing knowledge at the Communicable Disease Centre in Atlanta of infections. And then if we go towards the bottom of the page, we see reference in the last paragraph to delay between initial symptoms and diagnosis. If we go over the page, we see reference just towards the middle of the page to mortality rate. And then if we go to the next page, the bottom half of the page, sorry, I should start with the top half of the page, my apologies. There's reference in the third line, since then reported cases of a similar syndrome have been noted in, and then there are various categories, now very familiar categories, including the following: recently in 7 hemophiliacs, 6 of whom also have no association with drugs or sexual promiscuity. 3 cases have been described in the UK and 1 in Spain. All probably acquired their disease in the USA. However, 4 cases were recently observed in Denmark. And then if we go further down the page, we have the discussion of etiology, again in similar terms to the discussion in the November 1982 version of Dr. Krask's paper. So he discounts effect of drugs in paragraph 1. He suggests that cytomegalovirus as a cause is unlikely in paragraph 2. And then if we go over the page, he alights upon 3 as the most likely cause. So sexual promiscuity, intravenous drug abuse, possibly the transfusion of commercial blood concentrates. This time, below paragraph 3, rather than referring to the issue of hepatitis vaccines, he says this: if 3 is the most likely cause, then it is possible that such an agent might be present in the plasma pools used to prepare commercial factor VIII and IX concentrate manufactured from donor plasma collected in the USA. He refers in the next paragraph, if we go further down the page, to 3 patients having acquired the disease where the most likely mode of transmission was blood or platelet transfusions. Refers then to the incubation period. Says the most recent information suggests that at least 10 haemophilia A patients have been reported with clinical features of the syndrome. And that at the end of that paragraph, that 5 of those have since died. There's reference to possibility of sexual transmission at the bottom of the page. And then if we go to the next page, and we look at the last, the first paragraph, the last 2 sentences, he says, all the epidemiological evidence is consistent with the existence of a transmissible agent whose mode of spread is remarkably similar to that of hepatitis B. And then he refers to precautions against cross-infection. And then says, it's thought likely that batches of factor VIII concentrate which might contain the AIDS agent came into use since January the 1st, 1980 in the USA. The Communicable Disease Centre of the US Public Health Service at Atlanta, Georgia, therefore has requested the UK Hemophilia Centre directors to cooperate with them in a survey by reporting cases of AIDS possibly associated with transfusion of US commercial factor VIII concentrate. And he says cases will also be notified to the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre in Colindale, London.
Could you just go back a couple of
Yes.
pages? It says there, 6 lines down, recently in 7 hemophiliacs, 6 of whom also have no association with drugs or sexual promiscuity. Then if we go over a couple of pages, back a page, And again, I think
there's a reference to 10 patients.
that's it. It's the
yes,
reference to 10.
The reason for the difference, sir, is this. It only becomes apparent if we look at the footnotes. So if we go on 2 pages, please, Shomik. Footnote 4 is the source of the 7 haemophiliacs. So that's public reporting, and that's in MMWR. I think that's, I don't know which, without checking, that might be the December MMWR.
Well, I think December was more than...
I think it may have been. So
it,
it may have been an earlier MMWR. The 10 patients, so Dr. Kraska's, the most recent information suggests at least 10. That's footnote 8, and he says it's a personal communication from Dr. Dale Lawrence, CDC Task Force on AIDS.
Yes, it's what Dr. Main has picked up on in her statement, I think, is the lower figure.
Yes, that might be right. The 10 figure is the figure discussed, I think, in the January immuno meeting at London Airport.
Yes.
We'll check the MMWRs for December. I think you're right, sir, that it may be the 10 figure and the 7 figure is earlier, but we can check that.
I think then it was 8 confirmed cases and 7 or 8 anyway.
Yes.
And then by sometime between January and May, it grew to 11, I think. In the States. In the States,
yes. Those are cases all in the States. So we know Dr. Main's present at that meeting at the Excelsior Hotel, Heathrow Airport, 24th of January, and we know that this letter and its attachments was sent to all Haemophilia Centre directors. For the sake of completeness, I'll just, as well as looking at the form, we'll just look at the other 2 documents. So if we go to the other 2 documents that accompanied the letter, if we go to HCDO 40273_078, that's as it were, a note for directors as to conditions, symptoms and findings to look out for and report. And we can see from the 3rd page that's also dated the 1st of March 1983. And then if we go to HCDO 40517_004, that's the form that directors were asked to complete in relation to possible cases. And of course, we've looked by way of example at the actual form completed by Professor Bloom in relation to the Cardiff case. So those are the communications from Haemophilia Centre to Haemophilia Centre directors in March of 1983. If we then go to HCDO 603_008, this is the special meeting of reference centre directors held on the 13th of May 1983, and it's right to note that Dr. Main was not in attendance at that meeting. It was, however, obviously a very significant meeting. How the discussion was communicated to Dr. Main and when it was communicated to Dr. Main, we don't know. Again, we've looked at this on a number of occasions. If we just go briefly down the page, we'll see Professor Bloom outlined the background to the meeting and its purpose. Recent publicity had caused considerable anxiety to haemophiliacs and their medical attendants, as well as to the Department of Health. If we go over the page, sorry, it was the previous page, my apologies. Yes, if we go down, it says, this is halfway down this long paragraph, to date in the UK, 1 haemophiliac is suspected of suffering from AIDS. So that again is, we anticipate, the Cardiff case that Professor Bloom is there referring to. And again, Dr. Main in her litigation report refers to a knowledge of there being that case. following that meeting, recommendations were sent to all centre directors, so that would have included Dr. Main, in June of 1983. And the reference for that is HCDO 40/270_004. It's the letter of the 24th of June 1983. It refers to the special meeting of the reference centre directors in the opening paragraph. And then says this: at the above mentioned meeting on May the 13th, the following general recommendations were agreed. 1, for mildly affected patients with haemophilia A or von Willebrand's disease and minor lesions, treatment with DDAVP should be considered. Because of the increased risk of transmitting hepatitis by means of large pool concentrates in such patients, this is in any case the usual practice of many directors. 2, for treatment of children and mildly affected patients or patients unexposed to imported concentrates, many directors already reserve supplies of NHS concentrates, cryoprecipitate or freeze-dried, and it would be circumspect to continue this policy. And then it goes on to say that it was agreed at the 13th of May meeting that there was as yet insufficient evidence to warrant restriction of the use of imported concentrates in other patients in view of the immense benefits of therapy. And although Dr. Main was not present at that meeting, it's clear from her evidence that accorded with her own view. And she talks on multiple occasions throughout her various statements of what she regarded as the immense benefits of treatment with factor concentrates. In relation to this letter, Dr. Main's evidence is that this essentially reflected existing practice at the Belfast Haemophilia Centre. We've looked already at the position of children and seen that those who were being treated at the Royal Belfast Hospital for Sick Children were treated with cryoprecipitates, but that there were 2 severely affected children treated with factor concentrate. So it's, I think, not entirely correct to say that it was the policy across the board for all children. In terms of paragraph 1, suggestion there of treatment with DDAVP, we've seen from the annual returns comparatively infrequent reference to DDAVP, albeit it's right that I note we don't have every return for the early part of the 1980s. We do see von Willebrand's patients apparently being treated largely with cryoprecipitate. In terms of mildly affected patients or patients previously unexposed to imported concentrates, the position is less clear in relation to Belfast. I don't think we have any specific evidence about a particular treatment policy in relation to previously untreated patients. In relation to those who were mildly affected hemophiliacs or those whose haemophilia was of moderate severity, Dr. Main addresses this in her witness statement at WITN 0736009. If we pick it up at the bottom of page 17, bottom half of the page, you'll see reference in the bold print to the question posed by the inquiry, which refers to the June 1983 UK HCDO recommendations, and she's asked what the Belfast Centre's policy is. And her answer is as follows: as described above, the policy of using cryoprecipitate for treating mildly affected patients and children was adhered to, but at times proved in practice to be much more complex than expected. She then says that cryoprecipitate DDAVP and antifibrinolytic agents were and are used for the management of von Willebrand syndrome. And then over the page, she sets out in paragraph 19.1, and we looked at this or a similar passage yesterday, the position in relation to children. But then in relation to people with mild or moderate bleeding disorder, she deals with that in the bottom half of this page and says this in 20.1, effective treatment of bleeding disorders is patient-specific and needs to take account of individual circumstances. Occasionally, it was necessary to use concentrates for patients whose bleeding disorders were classified as mild or moderate. I can best illustrate circumstances in which this situation arose by reference to specific examples. And then she sets out in her next paragraph an example of two brothers who had what might be described as a typical level for a mildly affected patient, but asserts that clinically they were much more severely affected and that appropriate doses of cryoprecipitate proved totally ineffective. And if we go over the page, paragraph 20.4 suggests that in relation to those patients, they resorted to concentrates. And then she gives another example in 20.5 and 20.6 of other patients, and in paragraph 20.6 talks about then the use of concentrate and says this: theoretically, I would have advocated the use of much larger doses of cryoprecipitate, but by the time these results were available, she gives a description of the tests that were undertaken in the above paragraph. The patients had become used to concentrate and rejected cryoprecipitate. She doesn't say what information was given to the patients to enable them to make an informed decision as between concentrates and cryoprecipitate. And then says, I've gone into these cases in some detail to explain that classification of bleeding disorders as mild or moderate in vivo activity is not always straightforward, nor is it a reliable indication of patients' clotting factor 8. Limiting treatment to, for example, cryoprecipitate is in practice not always as easy as it might seem in theory. So it would appear that whilst Dr. Main is saying that her general policy in relation to those who were mildly affected was to treat with cryoprecipitate and not concentrate, there were cases of those who were not severely affected who were treated with factor concentrates. So that's the position as at June 1983. We then, in terms of Haemophilia Centre Directors meetings, moved to the meeting on the 17th of October 1983, which is at PRSE 304440. So the Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting, 17th of October 1983. Dr. Main is listed as present on the second page of attendees. And if we go to page 10, under the heading Any Other Business, this is the meeting at which Dr. Chisholm raised the question of reversion to cryoprecipitate for home therapy, and Professor Bloom is reported as expressing the view that there was no need for patients to stop using commercial concentrates because at present there was no proof that the commercial concentrates were the cause of AIDS. And we've again canvassed in a number of previous hearings the significance or otherwise of the phrase no proof. You'll recall, sir, that the discussion goes on to talk about ease of access to cryoprecipitate as opposed to difficulty in getting large amounts of commercial concentrates. In relation to the Belfast Centre, it doesn't appear there was any lack of access to commercial concentrates, and we've seen them being used in large measure during the early 1980s. But it also doesn't appear that there was any lack of access to cryoprecipitate. And you'll recall yesterday Dr. Main saying that there was a sufficient supply of cryoprecipitate from the Regional Transfusion Centre itself in Northern Ireland. And I should then go to the next page, which is an update from Dr. Krask under the heading Current Situation Regarding AIDS, and that sets out the work he's proposing to do. And then we'll see halfway down that paragraph, there was some discussion regarding the two cases of AIDS in Hemophiliacs in the UK. And so that by this time is the Cardiff case and the Bristol case. And Dr. Scott gave details about his case, and that's a reference, we understand, to the Bristol case. So that's the position as at the 17th of October 1983. If we go back to Dr. Main's litigation report at CBLA 5072_024, and we pick it up at page 33. So I've already referred to, that's it, if we go to the top half of the page. I've already referred to the first sentence, which was looking at 1982, and then we can see Dr. Main referring to the March 1983 paper. That's Dr. Krusk's paper that we looked at a few minutes ago. You're right, sir, she refers to the 7 hemophiliacs there, rather than the figure of 10. If we go, if we look towards the bottom of this paragraph, she says, the directors considered it possible that an infectious agent could be present in blood and present in particular in the factor concentrates used to treat haemophilia. So that's Dr. Main's articulation of what her understanding was of the views of Haemophilia Centre, reference centre directors, which was the small cohort of which she was a number at that time.
So what she's describing is that giving people who suffer from haemophilia commercial concentrate was recognised before the end of 1982 as making them an at-risk group, that the risk was one which was recognised by her colleagues as reference centre directors and was known as a real and realistic possibility in very early 1983.
Yes, precisely. If we pick it up in the next paragraph, we see Dr. Main saying this: throughout 1983, publications occurred with increasing frequency, confirming the presence of some, if not all, the preceding immune abnormalities to be present in homosexuals, in multi-transfused adults, children, and in some haemophiliac patients. And then we see she refers to some publications, so a January 1983 publication by Jones. And then if we go over the page, and that's Dr. Peter Jones' publication in the Lancet, Altered Immunity and Haemophilia. If we go over the page, thank you, that's the right page, sorry. We see in the top of the page she's referring to the Defourge article in the New England Journal of Medicine in January 1983. The White article is a 1983 editorial in the Annals of Internal Medicine. I don't have the precise date in 1983, but it sounds like it's early 1983 because she then goes on to say this, after referring to the White article: such publications plus the media coverage of the syndrome in the press, on radio and television caused great anxiety to patients and their Haemophilia Centre physicians. Therefore, in February 1983, a special meeting of the reference centres was convened to plan measures which might be undertaken regarding surveillance of patients in their treatment. And I've already referred to that meeting. She describes it in further detail further down. It may be that she's conflating the February and May 1983 meetings to some extent in her narrative here, but she then talks, bottom of the page, about the recommendations sent to centre directors in June 1983. If we go to the top of the next page, she refers to a discussion about AIDS at the World Haemophilia Federation Congress in Stockholm, and says this: there was great awareness of the AIDS problem amongst both the users and the treaters, and she records that further reports of immunological abnormalities and haemophilia were presented, and talks about patients attending the meeting expressing worry regarding the possible curtailment of their treatment. And a theme, which so you might wish to consider whether it arises from this part of her litigation report, appears to be a theme of saying, well, this was or may have been known to patients because of what was being reported in the media and or through attendance at the World Haemophilia Federation Congress. There's no narrative in the litigation report of discussions with patients specifically. I'll come on to what Dr. Main says on that subject in her witness statements in a little while. And then if we go to the bottom of this page, she refers to, by September 1983, 2 haemophiliacs being in the UK who were suspected of contracting AIDS following treatment with commercial concentrates. She suggests the haemophilia centres were circularised informing them of the batch numbers of the suspected infected factor VIII concentrates. It's not currently clear to me what that's a reference to at that point in time. But we do know that investigative work was being undertaken by Dr. Krask looking at batches, so maybe that's what she's referring to. Surveillance and collation of data was undertaken by the Hepatitis Working Party, and then she refers to the report by Dr. Daly and Dr. Scott, which was in the Lancet in late 1983, November 1983, the first death of a UK haemophiliac from PCP. And she records that at that time, the world statistics indicated that some 26 haemophilia A patients and 2 haemophilia B patients had been reported to CDC as having AIDS. She then goes on over the page, I'm not going to go through this part in detail, to talk about the identification of HTLV3 and various publications in that regard in the course of 1984. And at the bottom of the page, she reports that she refers to an article about patients having antibodies to HTLV3, and then says during the same month, and I need to check which month that is because I don't think the...
Well, that's the article in I think September in the Lancet, isn't it? Popovich et al., which talks it's Tynesong Popov, I think it is.
The Popovich article that she refers to is a publication in Science in 1984, and without checking, I can't recall, I'm afraid, the month. And then the editorial in the BMJ that she says accepted that AIDS was transmitted by blood products is an editorial entitled Infection, Immunity and Blood Transfusion, the author being given as Bruce Trott, which, again, I'll need to check the month.
Yes.
And then reference to the Danish study that was in the Lancet. Again, I, without checking, I can't recall off the top of my head which month it was. Well, in fact, so that I needn't go back to it, if we go to the next page and look at the bottom half of the page, she says this. This is obviously looking generally in the United Kingdom and not specifically at Belfast, because this was a report for the HIV litigation to the Department of Health. But she says this: the results of antibody testing of the UK Hemophiliacs accumulated during 1985. It was found that 44% were positive. 1983 was found to be the major year of infection, established from the availability of retrospective testing for some but not all patients. And then she says this: thus, the recommendations to revert to cryoprecipitate, unfortunately, would have been too late to prevent infection. Now, given that those recommendations appeared in, amongst other things, the New England Journal of Medicine in January of 1983, how logically, it can be said that that recommendation would have been too late to prevent infection if 1983 is the major year of infection. Well, it simply doesn't follow chronologically. And then it's perhaps worth reading Dr. Main's observations in the following paragraph. She says this: the foregoing paragraphs indicate that the growing awareness of the grave threat of infection to haemophiliac patients through AIDS. I think there must be a verb missing there. She refers to, during these years, 1982 to 1985, dramatic developments in medicine received worldwide publicity. Medicine is both a science and an art. Scientific research forms the basis for advances in treatment. The art is the appropriate application of the science. Members of the medical profession and laymen are entitled to express public opinions regarding the state of the art at any time. Media reporters are particularly adept in this respect. However, in the light of subsequent scientific knowledge, the expressed opinions may require revision. And then she says such opinions are documented in paragraph 63. To understand that, we need to look at which version of the HIV litigation statement of claims she's referring to. But she says this: their expression was based on the then available evidence and reflected the element of doubt which existed regarding the magnitude of the AIDS problem in haemophilia and its causation. They did not unduly underestimate or understate the position during the year 1983, a feeling which now might be construed by the aid of the retrospectoscope. So it's not entirely clear what's being said in that. It appears to be suggesting that there should be the avoidance of retrospective reflection or any application of hindsight.
Well, I, at the moment, what I'm inclined to do, but obviously it's subject to any submissions I may later receive at the end of the inquiry, that what she appears to be saying is that the position during the year 1983 was indeed understated and underestimated. However, that is what appears now looking back. At the time, the science had not advanced sufficiently to allow for those conclusions properly to be drawn.
That may be what she's saying, and of course you have the benefit of being able to look yourself at the contemporaneous materials from 1982 and 1983 to assess that claim.
It's not a question of what was the cause, what was the problem, was it understated. It's a question of whether it should have been stated in a different way is a question I think she's addressing.
Yes. What was understood as a risk, what action could and should have been taken, what information could and should have been provided to patients to enable informed judgments to be made by those whose health and lives were potentially being placed at risk. Going to then just, in terms of UK HCDA meetings, refer to one further meeting on this topic. It's the December 1984 meeting at Elstree at HCDO 40394_117. Again, we've looked at this on a number of occasions, but not for the purpose of highlighting Dr. Main's attendance. So it was the Haemophilia Reference Centre Directors meeting held at BPL 10th of December 1984 to discuss what should by now be done. And we can see from the list of attendees Dr. Main there, along with a range of other representatives. I'm not going to go through the detail of the meeting. There is no particular contribution to the meeting from Dr. Main that's identified in the minutes. You will recall, sir, it records the Reference Centre Director's discussion about what should now be done, both in terms of testing patients and in terms of ceasing to use commercial concentrates. We can see Dr. Main writing about the meeting in brief terms at BPLL 0010480. She writes to Dr. Lane at BPL on the 12th of December 1984, thanking him and his staff for the hospitality at the meeting, and says this: "The meeting was certainly beneficial, if indeed somewhat depressing." Just perhaps picking up on the issue of reflection as set out at the end of that section of Dr. Main's litigation report. If we go to LOTH 5080_007, this is a rather later letter. It's August 1993, so it's 3 years on from the production of the litigation report, and obviously a decade on from the key events in 1983. But it's a letter Dr. Main wrote to the editor of The Lancet about what had happened in relation to Professor Alain in France. And she says this, picking it up in the second sentence: "This action," that's the imprisonment of Professor Alain, "instilled a feeling of dismay and grave concern over the fate of such a respected colleague, one who I know personally and for whom I have the highest regard for his scientific contributions to the field of haemophilia and for his humanitarian attitude to the entire problem of HIV infection contracted by haemophiliac patients through the receipt of blood products." And then she says this: "The evolvement of the HIV problem within the haemophilia population has caused immeasurable distress to patients and to all physicians treating them. The doctors concerned were guilty of one fault, namely that of ignorance. The imposition of a prison sentence in these circumstances seems illogical." Now, I draw attention to that, not particularly because of Dr. Main's views in relation to the fate of Professor Alain, but because of what she suggests as a more general point: the doctors concerned, which would encompass presumably not only those in the position of Professor Alain, but all those involved with treating haemophiliac patients with blood products, so all haemophilia centre directors, including herself, guilty only of ignorance, she says. And no doubt for you to describe whether that is an accurate characterisation of the position. If we turn next on the issue of the extent of HIV infection in the Northern Ireland haemophilia community to one of Dr. Main's witness statements. It's at WITN 0736006. So it's one of her statements from last year. If we pick it up at the bottom of the page, statistics, she says this: "It's not difficult to recall the data for the overall UK percentage of treated haemophilia patients who became infected with HIV. I believe it to be 44.5%. Some regions in England and Wales attained figures greater than 70%. The comparable figure for Northern Ireland was 14.5%, clearly anomalous. I well recall presenting the Northern Ireland data to a meeting of the UK Haemophilia Directors Organisation in autumn 1985. Some colleagues, not unsurprisingly, were politely sceptical about the veracity of the results. Further testing was carried out by all centres. In Northern Ireland, I organised for all samples to be tested in duplicate and simultaneously in the Belfast Virology Laboratory and in the Middlesex Hospital, London. The Northern Ireland results were unchanged." If we go to, I think it's the next page. Yes. If we pick it up in paragraphs 8 and 9, these are where she derives her figures from. Of the 110 annually treated patients, 43 were on home treatment. Of this group, 15 became HIV positive. those patients had received comparable amounts of factor concentrate to those in the rest of the UK. The 16th positive HIV patient was espoused within the home treatment group. There were no positive patients in the non-home treatment group and no children seroconverted. The number 16 is accurate, however, the final number included in the home treatment group may be 43 or 47, my memory eludes me. And then she...
just pausing there, of those who are on home treatment, which one would tend to be, one would expect, the serious, severe Hemophilia A patients, largely, it's just over a third.
Yes, it is. Yes, so as always with statistics, it depends what you're presenting and what you're looking as your overall group. But that's absolutely right, sir. A third of those on home treatment became HIV positive with one infection from a spousal partner as well. There is then what Dr. Main, in fairness, characterises as conjecture in the following paragraph. She says, a conjectural conclusion may be appropriate. I speculate that repeated injections of treatment, regardless of plasma source, may induce a degree of immune tolerance, perhaps mediated through alteration within the complement system. It does not seem to matter whether the treatment is cryoprecipitate or concentrate sourced in Scotland, Europe or the USA. Not entirely clear what is meant by that. Figures from Scotland and Northern Ireland would indicate the cryoprecipitate may well have been the safest product available at that time. However, it was cumbersome to use. Accurate dosage was impossible. Whether that puts it too high, given what else we've seen about cryoprecipitate usage, is a matter for your judgment, sir. And home treatment impracticable. And again, whether it's correct to characterise it as impracticable as opposed to less practicable is a matter for you. The advent of factor VIII concentrate in small vials and with accurate dosage revolutionised life for the haemophilic patient. Furthermore, an alternative explanation might have a straightforward numerical basis. Each company utilised approximately 25,000 donors. If, due to large patient numbers, financial constraints or problems relating to product availability, any one patient could be treated with 2, 4 or even up to 6 different products, thus their exposure could be increased even to 125,000 donors, leading to the possibility of increased viral conversion. Regardless of underlying reason, there seems to be a definite pointer to the fact that patients do better on one product. And just picking it up over the page, she refers to paragraph 10. One severely affected patient was treated with a batch of new concentrate which was contaminated by HIV. Armour informed me after it had been used, the patient was in the home treatment group and thankfully did not seroconvert. What we don't, I'm afraid, sir, I think have sufficient data in relation to every year throughout the first part of the 1980s to look at the individuals who were infected with HIV and to trace whether they were treated with more than one product, and if so, which products. And that's because we don't have the returns data for some of the key years. So in relation to the, we've got the bald returns, for example, for 1983, but not the detailed breakdown of individual patients that we have, for example, for 1984. So I'm afraid we can't, at least on the information currently available, verify the correctness or otherwise, or the plausibility or otherwise of Dr. Main's conjecture. So that's what she says in her statement in relation to rates of infection. So perhaps, given the time, I'll just show you one more document which just picks up upon her last point about the communication she received about an HTLV3, a contaminated batch. That's at ARMO 40382. Yes. So it's a letter, 10th of May 1985, from ARMA to Dr. Main. She refers to the letter refers to one donor whose plasma was incorporated into pools from which our factor VIII was produced has developed AIDS. And then in the third paragraph, only one batch in the UK is implicated. Fortunately, this is a heat-treated batch, and he gives the batch number. This small heat-treated batch was distributed in December 1984 and January 1985 to a few centres only, of which yours is one. We anticipate the product has already been used. And then a suggestion that if it hasn't been, it should be returned, and there'll be reimbursement or replacement. So that's, I think, the communication to which Dr. Main was referring in her statement. So there's some more to say in relation to HIV and AIDS, so perhaps we could pick that up after the break.
Yes, well, let's take a break now till 11:45.
Thank you.